10 years. That's a huge increase, and it cannot be genetic, and yet our government has spent almost all of its money and all of its efforts and everything that you read in the newspaper, 90% of it, well, we're looking for genetic. We found a gene related to autism. The bottom line is they haven't found one single gene that would account for more than a fraction of 1% of the cases of autism. It's just a malarkey that they're spreading thick to keep from facing the fact that it was our government's Center for Disease Control vaccine program that started this epidemic. Now, why do I think that? We know it's not genetic. There's a genetic susceptibility, no doubt about that, just like there is for every toxin. But this toxin had to start out in about 1988, and it had to go in all 50 states at the same time. That's Alaska, Hawaii, California, Florida, Maine, Nebraska, and everything in between. That eliminates coal-fired power plants as being the major cause, or about anything. It has to be something that's very personal and something that every child was exposed to. It had to be an exposure that occurred in these children before they were 2 years old. You don't see 5-year-olds all of a sudden becoming autistic, or 6 years old or 10-year-old. It was just a new baby. So you look at this and you say there's some exposure that's relevant to infants that occurred very early on. And it had to go in all 50 states at the same time. And the reason we know that, if you look at the U.S. Department of Education, where they, for Individuals with Disabilities Act, all of a sudden we started having to have more classes to take care of children born after 1988 and 1990 because they had autism. They had learning disabilities, neurological deficits. So we have to have a toxicant and we have to identify it. Then you come up, that toxicant has to affect boys many, many times more than it affects girls because boys get this disease a lot more. Think of a toxin that you can, I've asked them, I've asked state health, what toxin do you know of that affects boys 4 to 10 times more than girls? They can't tell me of one. So that tells you that that toxin most likely is a mercury-based toxin. And the exposure has to be there, and it fits with the mandated vaccine program because on the day of birth, they injected into these children the amount of mercury that would be safe eating fish by EPA standards if the baby weighed 275 pounds. Okay. Then you take the next step. And this is where I'm telling you the science is sick in this country. Our Food and Drug Administration isn't worth a pile of warm spit when it comes to resolving this problem. If you find 2 dead bodies over there and you say, well, they look like they've been poisoned, how do you find out if they're poisoned or not? You take tissue samples. You all watch CSI. You do biochemistry on their system, and you look at the enzymes that are inhibited. You look at the pathways that are disrupted. And I think Dr. Blaylock will agree with me. All these autistic children are low in glutathione. They can't methylate their macromolecules right. They can't take sulfite to sulfate. And when you go through all the biochemistry, that means that toxin doesn't act at one site. It has to be a toxin with what we call pleiotypic or many sites of action. And mercury easily explains the biochemistry we see, the abnormal biochemistry we see in autistic children. Nothing else can do that. I challenge them to bring up one thing else that would do that. You add to that, there's very little, if any, autism amongst the Amish population that don't vaccinate like the regular population. You don't find them in Health First in Chicago where they don't vaccinate at all. Not one autistic child in 35,000. If you divided that number by 150, that's how many autistic children they should have had. You can put all of this obvious data in front of our government agencies, and they will just say, well, we'll take that into consideration. Then they go in a closet, they hide, they lie, and they're deceptive. The American public has to get very, very upset about this, or they're going to do nothing. They have damaged 2 generations of American children, and it's not just the autistic children. On our SAT scores, you remember 15 years ago we worried about girls not doing as well in math and science as boys because boys were more aggressive, dominated the classroom. That has totally flip-flopped. But it's not because the boys or the girls have gotten better, it's the boys have gotten worse. We now have to practice affirmative action to get boys in dental school, medical school, law school, etc., because their ability to do academic, to study hard enough and concentrate, to to do well academically has been severely damaged. And these are the ones that go to college. Autistic children don't take the SAT test. So we have a real problem, and I think it's something like the Health Freedom Group that's really going to have to get this politically advertised and take this out to the American public and to the Congress, because you are never going to get the ADA, the FDA, the CDC, or the American Academy of Pediatrics to admit that they caused this disaster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Boyd. Dr. Eisenstein, you said you wrote a book called Don't Vaccinate Before You Educate, following up with Professor Haley's incredible summation about vaccinations and why boys have more autism than girls. It's really criminal. Dr. Eisenstein.
Oh, thank you very much. I am the dubious, nefarious, lying and cheating doctor who's the head of the practice that allegedly claims that we have virtually no autism in 35,000 children. And the 35,000 is a guess. What's not a guess is we have 23,000 active charts in the practice. I have 3 partners for more than 25 years, Dr. Rosie, Dr. Shattower, and Dr. Zumhagen. Got 2 part-time partners, and Dr. Rosie is my older brother, and Dr. Zumhagen and Dr. Shattower are my younger brother, so I have middle child syndrome, even though I'm the oldest child in the family of 3 brothers. I got into this backwards. I'm really not even into this. I'm so honored to be in this panel with such incredible scientists, documentary filmmakers, dentists, lawyers. I'm a student of Dr. Robert Mendelsohn, and some of in the audience may have remembered Dr. Mendelsohn. He passed away quite a few years ago. He was the National Medical Director of Head Start in the late 60s, and he got fired. He was appointed by President Johnson. And the reason he got fired is because he found that Head Start, the minute the children went back into the regular school system, all the gains were lost. So he recommended that Head Start go through high school. Well, he said they fired him instantly, and the University of Illinois Medical School hired him. And that was the greatest blessing to me, because I heard that you could take his course and you didn't have to show up and you could pass. And I was newly married, and we were expecting our first baby, who's in booth 207 right now. He's almost 38 years old, I went to his class, and my wife said, Karen is sitting in the back, that was the last time he didn't show up, because he was the most engaging, challenging professor I ever had in my life. He became not only my mentor, and the godfather to all 6 of my children. And he made the statement in 1971, every vaccine causes neurological damage. And in 71, there was very little autism really around. But we were starting to see the ADD, the ADHD. It was just the beginning of this whole trend. And so my life has been easy from that standpoint, and the partners who I've accumulated over the years, in the 37 years I've been in practice, we've delivered over 15,000 babies at home. And so we're now in the midst of trying to really refine the statements I've made. The reason I said virtually is because I don't have the records on every single person. I could tell you when they came to us what's happened from the time they came, and I could tell you very simply they got no vaccines. But now I've got to go back in and find what happened before. So we do have almost 6,000 families who we delivered who have absolutely no vaccines. And I didn't even know that there was an autism epidemic until I was visited by a writer, Dan Olmsted, from the UPI, United Press International. I asked him one thing when he wanted to interview me. I said, trust me, you will be fired within a year after you talk to me, or you will write a story saying I'm a dubious, nefarious doctor, then you'll get promoted. And sure enough, that's what happened to Dan Olmsted. I think that everything I've heard here just intensifies my belief and my love of Dr. Mendelsohn, who taught to myself and to all my patients, really, of vaccine awareness. And actually, there's a better book than mine. It's Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. It's Don't Vaccinate. The education, what big deal so you get educated? What do you do after you're educated, And so, I think that it's the most absurd thing in the world that we have to fight for legislation in order to get mercury out of vaccines, just one thing, or mercury out of amalgams, or use them. I mean, it seems stupid. I mean, like you said, Dr. Haley and Dr. Blaylock, oh, this is not even 9th grade. This is 8th grade, you know, biology, that we know that mercury is a toxin, you know, I think we're seeing a movement. The latest study came out on vaccines, which is obviously one of the things I'm most interested in. 2% of people in this country don't vaccinate. 44% question it, and 54% believe in it. We've got almost half the people who question vaccines right now. And you know, that's the beginning of a change. My father used to always say, America's the greatest country in the world. That they'll believe something, believe it, and believe it, and all of a sudden it becomes obvious it's wrong and no one believes it anymore. And I think that's what's going to happen. And I think we're very close to that, the end of this whole vaccine era, which has questionably done anything except poison people. Thank you.
You know, for me, it's just so exciting because there's such a wealth of knowledge up here and a variety of health. In my personal experience, I think everybody's mercury poisoned, you know, pretty much. At some level, there is mercury in your body, either through the air, through vaccinations, through teeth, or eating fish. And so what these gentlemen and Kelly and Dr. Meyer, they have the opportunity to share that with you. And I personally, without their knowledge, I don't know if I would be alive today because I was so severely mercury poisoned. But their quest and their desire to help us get better and recover our health, it is our duty as stewards of our own planet and our own temple, which is our body, to take this information out to everyone. And I have a question for Dr. Haley. And then we're going to start asking questions from the audience. So if you would come up to the mic, if anyone has a question, then we'll start to do it like that, because it's just a lot of information that I'm sure that you can get from these guys. You said about a fecal test versus a urine test for mercury toxicity. Can you elaborate a little on that?
The point I was making is that the experts for the American Dental Association always refer to urinary. The experts for the American Dental Association, when they estimate mercury levels in the body, always measure it in the urine. All of the studies done on animals and on humans show that less than 10% goes out in the urine. Over 90% goes out in the fecal route. And so they do that just so they can underestimate the amount of mercury exposure that's going into the, coming from the amalgam fillings into the human body. And it was actually David Quigg from Doctor's Data measured the mercury levels in people with and without amalgam fillings and found that sometimes it would be 190 micrograms of mercury a day in the fecal material of people with extensive amalgam fillings. That's a very toxic load. It's a very toxic load. And so the bottom line is the American Dental Association just flat is deceptive in presenting its data to the American people and to Congress and probably to the FDA.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is your feeling on the calcium EDTA challenge test to find if there's heavy metals?
Okay, please repeat the question.
Oh, what is his take on provoking the mercury to come out with a heavy metal chelator such as calcium EDTA or DMPS or DMSA, is it?
Well, there's two questions there. One, EDTA won't pull mercury off of a thiol-bound protein at all.
Okay.
So it won't do it. DMPS can. The thing is, if you measure the amount of mercury that's taken out by a chelation, it's a very few micrograms. And like I told you, you're getting a minimum of 4 micrograms per filling per day in your body. It's like emptying a 50-gallon barrel with a tablespoon to try and do chelation therapy to remove amalgam fillings. I mean mercury from amalgam fillings, if they have that rate of income, going into the body. It's the best they've had until recently, I think.
Dr. Blaylock, what has been your experience in your field dealing with mercury toxicity? And what do your colleagues say?
Well, you know, the thing about the medical profession, they're totally unaware of this. You know, my colleagues, if you ask them about mercury toxicity, it's a deer in the headlights. They have no idea what you're talking about. I've sent patients to the medical center, to the toxicologist that had clear elevation of numerous toxic metals. They sent him back and saying they didn't see any problem at all. The man was obviously toxic. So the traditional medicine has absolutely no clue about this. The pediatricians have no clue whatsoever. And as I tell people, what they don't understand, particularly mothers, is that pediatricians know absolutely nothing about the brain, period. When you ask them about toxicity of metals on the brain, they know less than nothing. So, you know, our intellectual problem in the medical profession itself is absolutely enormous. So who do the medical professionals turn to for their answers? It's the very people that we've been talking about, the FDA, the Center for Disease Control, and the EPA. That's where they go for their answers, the American Academy of Pediatrics and American Dental Association. Now, the average pediatrician will get a pamphlet from the ADA that says, well, the mercury in a dental amalgam is bound. It cannot escape. It's fixed. And so the average pediatrician thinks they've gotten the final story. Now, it's been proven as absolute as you can prove anything in science, numerous ways, that the mercury constantly evaporates, is highly absorbed into the tissues of the mouth, particularly the olfactory nerve, goes straight to the part of the brain that's most affected in Alzheimer's disease. And as I said, when you measure the levels in the brain, they're highest in the olfactory tract, the entorhinal area, and the hippocampus, the very entry point. Because your amalgams are in your mouth, they're forming the gas goes up into your nose where your olfactory tract is, and you can track it. On radio labeling, you can see it going up the nerve into the brain. So when you say evidence-based, well, you can't get more pristine evidence than we have of its entry into the brain, of its toxicity, in every way you can look at it. But the average medical professional is taking the word of people who, there's no other way to say it, they're lying. They're absolutely lying.
Professor Haley,
there's no nice way to say it.
We're going to hear a lot of truth up here today, believe me. And I know Professor Haley for years now, and this guy's a warrior. From the day that I met him, he has come out of the box and he has never looked back.
Just to support what Dr. Blaylock said, there's only one thing known that you can treat brain homogeneous from normal human beings or expose rats to that will generate the abnormal biochemistry seen in Alzheimer's disease, including the formation of nerve fibrillary tangles, and that's mercury. Mercury is the only thing that will do that. It will cause the tubulin to disrupt, the neurofibrils to be exposed and form tangles, inhibit an enzyme called creatine kinase, which is 97% inhibited in AD versus age-matched control brain. There is absolutely overwhelming data. I know, I published it. And I know I lost my grants for publishing that. And no one has ever published that I've been wrong. But they did not want to fund us anymore.
Can you please repeat that, Boyd? You have to speak a little closer. Thank you. To the mic, a little closer.
I started out, I had my first NIH grant before I was a professor, a graduate student, postdoc at Yale. And I had NIH funding for 25, 27 straight years. And I had no trouble getting grants until I published the work that mercury could mimic the biochemical abnormalities seen in Alzheimer's disease brain.
In other words, folks, I'll bring it down a notch. Boyd stopped getting funding as soon as he proved that mercury does in fact enter the brain and causes neurological damage. And so in research and what these folks up here are doing, because they are pioneers, because they are humanitarians, because they are the truth givers and seekers, they don't get their funding because it's so controversial and it's so enormous that people don't want to be associated. Kelly, you have something to say about that?
Yeah, it's insanity. I was just at the HBO Alzheimer's Project. They did a series of specials on Alzheimer's, and of course, Boyd Haley wasn't involved in it, and they said nothing in terms of what the causation of Alzheimer's. And I met all of these scientists from UCLA in neurology that didn't, when I asked them, what they knew about mercury, they knew nothing. I mean, nothing. And it's just appalling that you can, 8th, 9th grade, that you should, on the periodic table of elements, that you should know that this is a toxin. And here, these are the people controlling those dollars, knowing nothing.
Just one comment. There's a book which you want to check out how bad it is. It's called Heavy Metals and Alzheimer's Neurological Pathology. It just came out from Belgium. And if you go read the book, they'll talk about the toxicity of zinc, calcium, manganese, iron, and copper, and they never mention mercury. All of the other 5 are essential metals you have to live. And there were articles written in there by major academic researchers talking about the biological problems that you would run into with too much of these metals if they got into them. And they're essential metals. And yet you've got grams of mercury in your mouth going up your, as Dr. Blaylock described, in retrograde transport. And mercury wasn't mentioned in the book.
Yeah, and to follow that up, I was just in London and I met with a barrister or a lawyer who wrote the environmental law book. And I was sitting there in this meeting and I have this law book this thick, and I'm going through the environmental law book and not a mention of the word mercury. And I'm in a meeting about something else, and I get through the book and I say, no mention of the word mercury. And he said, oh, well, they told me not to include it because it was already obvious in the book. And I think at that moment, this, 65-year-old lawyer kind of went, oh my God, he had been taken by his own people in the publishing of this book because it had been in there in the previous publication. So the powers that be are at work all over the place to stop the information from coming out. And one more silly thing, my cousin, my 5th grade, she's in 5th grade, is studying, their social studies. And I'm helping her with her homework on this particular day. And they have this whole explanation about mining. And the lengths they went to not include the word mercury in the process of mining, they called it a technology to mine. And I got so upset. My cousin was like, relax. But it's like they're removing the information in the grade school level.
Dr. Eisenstein, I have a question for both of you as practitioners at local. What has your experience been, because you're so removed from the norm of medical practice in this town? I mean, let's talk about Chicago, folks. And unfortunately, I haven't had any pizza. I haven't had anything. I'm in here, but we are in the headquarters of the ADA. I mean, it's all here in Chicago. So please tell us what your experience has been, because you are not of the norm and you don't follow the rules.
I'm definitely not the normal. I mean, and I definitely don't. I don't know. I follow different rules. We have about 10,000 visits to our offices yearly. And with 23,000 families, the average number of visits should be about 2.5 per family, which means we should be seeing about 50,000 visits in our office. Now, unless 40,000 people are going somewhere else, we have a uniquely different population. And I think that when Dr. Haley, did you mention that 1988, there was that big change around there? And that's when the American Academy of Pediatrics instituted its multi-vaccine program. The number of vaccines before 1988 was approximately 8 or 10, and after that it went up to 35 and 40. I can't even keep count, it's so much, And if you take a look at the amount of mercury that people are getting in the vaccines, it didn't even enter my mind because it wasn't anything we did. But if just alone the hepatitis B vaccine had it was like 25 micrograms per vaccine. It was given to, I think, Dr. Blaylock, and you're saying it's given to a one-day infant, and the toxicity level would require that infant to be 275 pounds. Now, I've delivered some big babies in my time, but that kind of goes over the top, you know. We really have an incredibly healthy population. We hardly see any asthma. We hardly see any diabetes.
But this is only your patients, right? This is
right. Yeah. I mean, I assume the rest of the world is different, you know. But I only live within my own world, you know. And I can tell you what's fascinating, because as a group, we decided about 20 years ago we were not going to treat asthma. We were not going to treat diabetes, because we felt that those were highly specialized diseases. It's not what we were doing. And after months and months, we realized we weren't referring out a patient a year for these diseases, which is just so fascinating, you know. And so the devastation effect of mercury is just overwhelming, you know. It's you know, something so blatantly obvious that you wonder, are we crazy or is the rest of the world crazy, you know? But I think that I think we're going to see change, because, you know, change comes slow, but then all of a sudden it rapidly happens. And I think this is laying the seeds for everything that's going to happen.
Boyd, did you want to follow up with that? Speak close.
I just want to point out one thing to the audience. We give more than double the vaccines of the next Western country that vaccinates. England gives about 16, we give 36. Yet we're number 41 on the infant mortality list. Can you think of 40 countries where the infants should live longer at a higher rate than in the United States? If you bring this up to the state health boards, they will argue that if people like me and Dr. Blaylock and this fellow are increasing people that will die of whooping cough because they're not vaccinated, and we're getting people telling people that there are dangers. And that the vaccines have eliminated many of the diseases such as whooping cough, measles, etc., then what deaths have we replaced those deaths with? Sudden infant syndrome, sudden death, infant death syndrome, pardon me, or whatever. But the bottom line is, we're the most highly vaccinated country in the world, and we have one of the worst records for infant mortality. And people ought to ask that question. That's the kind of thing you go to war over. What's killing our children? They're not doing a good job, and you can't get the CDC or any state health organization to answer that question.
We
used to be number 1 or 2.
I actually have a statement. My name is Alyssa Meininger. I've written on all these subjects. I'm a victim of mercury poisoning for my dental fillings. I live in Oklahoma, which we think differently. Over 12 years ago, another gal who is going to be here sometime today, and I challenged the hepatitis B being added to the mandatory list, and we call it compulsory list in Oklahoma. We ended up using our state laws, which are very populist, so we had lots of power. The legislature forced the head of the health department and his henchmen, including their agency lawyer, to meet with us at the Capitol with a referee. We delivered a 7-page letter asking, very politely, asking how they formed a policy, a vaccination policy, how they picked the committees, who was on these committees, could we have their names, please? And what we had done is we used the leverage of a populist lobbyist who came out of the Ralph Nader tradition. I was at the time the head of the Reform Party's Health Issues Committee, and I used Ross Perot's moniker on my shoulder. And this other gal was an anti-vaccinationist of note. We were able to get the list of the drug merchants that were dictating to us what was going on in vaccines and deciding. But what the purpose of this letter was to ask the question, in a state where the word no means no, because we do honor religious exemptions, we honor philosophical belief, and we don't have to, frankly, you just have to write your name and say, I don't want my child vaccinated with this, thank you. And that's it. And so our question was, if we live in a state where